Hi, everyone, and welcome to the infrastructure group conversation for June 4th, 2020. We've got a deck that everyone has been able to review, and we'll get into the agenda. Just a couple of things first. I want to note that we're paying a lot more attention to the overall level of availability each month. And since we're just past the end of May right now, last month's measure was 99.85. That did include a couple of abuse items. For two of those things, we had a misconfiguration within Cloudflare that since then we've corrected, and we've seen similar kind of abuse patterns which have not caused any impact. So really good thing there. And then each month as we go forward, we're going to be paying a lot more attention to how we're progressing in consistently hitting the 99.95 or above. So with that, we'll get into questions here. Sid, if you want to go ahead and verbalize yours.
Yeah, thanks. And I want to acknowledge the progress that's being made by the infrastructure team. The team seems to be firing on all cylinders, lots of progress, and it's a tough job because it's cost and availability and performance at the same time. So that is a very tricky job, and I think the team's doing a wonderful job. My question was, this quarter, we want to double the speed of GitLab.com to make it as fast as GitHub. I don't see it called out at the start of the presentation. And maybe that's because it seems that for now, we think it's an application development thing. I've seen, like, for example, the front-end team working on splitting the JavaScript code and things like that. Do we think this can be done without infrastructure help?
Yeah, and actually, there's a couple others chiming in here, but before that, I'll say, our top 1 and 2 focus, at least for this quarter, is really reliability and cost efficiency, and we do want to be there to help with some of the efforts that are going on across the rest of engineering, and from an infrastructure standpoint, intend to do that by doing more to formalize the stable counterparts that we have with those teams. And so, I mean, to your question as to if it's purely an application development thing, I absolutely don't think it is. But for this particular quarter, we're really focused on reliability and cost efficiency. And as I'd say, a priority like 2.5 or 3 there, having the counterparts that we have help with the other efforts going on in engineering. So I know others have. Andrew, if you wanted to comment as well.
Sure. I just wanted to point out, I think the biggest single effort that's going to make a difference right now that's ongoing, Sid, is it's a proof of concept. So it's not like fully baked yet, but it's a proof of concept for using server-side rendering. So if you look at what comes down in a web page on GitLab.com at the moment, before JavaScript kicks in and starts rendering everything on the client side, what comes down from the server is basically an empty page. And then the JavaScript loads, it fetches the data, and it generates everything. If you look at what happens on GitHub.com, when the page arrives, it's fully formed and ready to go. And so it's really hard for us to compete with that when we have to, load the JavaScript, compile the JavaScript, read the data, and then render the page. So that server-side rendering component would make a huge difference there. And there's some really good proof of concepts that are going on with that will make a massive difference, I think. So I just wanted to call that out. I'm just going to paste the issue in as well.
That's super exciting. Are we pretty sure that there's not something we're missing? Like, I remember, and this is years ago, and this was when we're talking about a very different team and a very different level of sophistication. But at a certain point, it was like, we were not measuring the HA proxy queue or something, or there was a queue in Nginx just after HA proxy. So we're measuring all the queues. We just forgot about measuring one of them. And that's where all the traffic was bunched up. Are we pretty sure that we're really down to these like technologically advanced solutions, or is there still some concern on how we're measuring and the complete stack?
I think so. So this is just like a gut feel really, but I think that there are like a whole bunch of small marginal gains that we could make there. But if you look at our time to first byte versus say GitHub as a comparison, they're pretty close together. And then it's really from there on out, you know, as we're fetching the data and we're compiling our JavaScript. So there's a whole lot of things that we can do around like compiling the JavaScript and having less JavaScript sent to the client, or making sure that between releases, you know, the JavaScript that hasn't changed, we don't download that again, and all sorts of things like that. And I think Lucas's team's looking at that. But really, like from a time to first byte, we're pretty similar. So we can make gains, but I think the biggest gain would be on the front end side.
Yeah, that
I'd
makes
like
a ton.
Sorry, I'd like to add to that. I think perhaps surprisingly, the long tail may be influenced by delays at the HA proxy layer. Just in the last 24 hours, I found some very tentative evidence of this. So I totally agree with Andrew that the majority case is absolutely not going to be influenced by this. But when someone has, you know, an intermittent occasional, wow, this feels really slow this time, and then it goes away, I think that may actually have a component there in the portion of the call path that sits between Cloudflare and HA proxy.
Cool.
I also had a couple of comments on this. On the measuring side, yeah, we're doing way better than we were a couple years ago. The memory team has done a great job of improving the metrics we have available to catch those problems with queuing. And with the switch from Unicorn to Puma, we are now much better, and we are not queuing nearly as often. We used to have thousands and thousands of queued requests in small bursts of a second or two, and those are mostly gone, which is really awesome to see. The Puma change really like fixed a bunch of that.
Well, all you cats and kittens, that's great news that new Puma is doing so good. And yeah, Andrew, I love what you said, that like the server-side rendering will make a really big difference. And in the meantime, we're still looking at tree shaking and more caching of the JavaScript. That makes sense. Matt, it's great to know that you have an eye on some bunching up. Maybe that's happening in the long tail, and those are super hard. And Ben, thanks for that answer. I feel this is great. Thanks for the conversation.
Okay, I think we've got Eric, you're next as far as the questions, if you wanted to verbalize this from the board of directors agenda.
Yeah, I woke up this morning and noticed we had an interesting question in the async agenda for the board of directors meeting today. So Matthew Jacobson from Iconic asked if we've seen any change in usage patterns on GitLab.com coming from so many customers working from home. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I've never thought about that angle, and which of our metrics might even capture that. It does seem like it might be trickier than it sounds to measure. I mean, in general, everything is going up and to the right, so you can have to control for that and then see changes up or down based on that. So just wanted to get people talking and thinking around how might we look for something like that, and you know, in the next hour, it could be determined if that's a a confident yes or no.
Just to kind of start the conversation off, I think that the first thing you would probably want to look at is notes and issues, or particularly notes on issues. So maybe we can take a look at how the rate of that has gone up in the last few months of new note creation on issues and merge requests, because that's the kind of thing people would do more if they're not in an office together, right?
Yeah, collaborating asynchronously, and if people are blurring the lines between work and personal, maybe they're spending an extra hour a day, making those comments to their colleagues and whatnot. That's a good thought. Do we have our traffic already segmented out in like, boom, here's nodes traffic, or do we have to sort of drill in to look at something like that?
We could look at like controllers in Prometheus at the nodes creation, or someone on the Rails side could probably tell us what the right controllers are, but we could look at how many times those are invoked in a day versus 6 months ago, if we can get that out of Thanos. Alternatively, we can use the logs that we store in GCS.
It does seem like an interesting kind of analytics thing of, you know, posing some probable changes in behavior, and then, you know, diving into to logs to see some of that and see what else is identified. Have we, I'm curious, just from the time I've been here and being limited, have we done things like that in the past, maybe even in other teams or across the data team or marketing or anywhere else, based on our logs?
I mean, this is the first time we've gotten a sociological question about to look at our logs. I'll say that the team's done a ton. Obviously, Andrew could speak more about this, about drilling deeply into logs, looking at performance trends and security trends and whatnot. This is a kind of a unique angle.
Yeah, it would be interesting. Like the you know, does people's behavior change? Do they do, you know, more board refinement type activity? You know, because of that need to be, you know, more async, or maybe just more time that they end up having as a result, and so that, you know, they're able to find quiet time to do things like board refinement, in addition to like adding more comments and notes.
So it sounds like it's safe to say I won't have an answer for Matt in an hour, but I'll tell him we can take this offline a little bit and see if there's an easy way to look for some behavior changes, for lack of a better term, in usage. Thanks.
All right, James, you want to verbalize your question?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, this is not so much a production question as it is just a business operation development question. You know, AWS and, you know, not as much GC, but, you know, they nickel and dime you, right? It's like every little piece costs a little bit. It's like a nickel an hour here and a dime an hour here. And, you know, I've seen a lot being on the demo side of things. I've seen a lot of people are going to go out and use GitLab to create a cluster, and then they're going to do their demo, and that cluster just kind of sits there. And sometimes they have stuff running in it, and sometimes they don't. And coming from a company whose product was to, well, several years back anyway, their product was to report up the summation of all the expenses of every little feature that a company was using in the cloud. You know, one of the things that we focused on a lot was having automation in place that would spin up our ecosystem when we came in, or down trim it in the evening, you know, or spin it down in the evening, right? So that things were only running when we were using them. And I understand that like GC is not charging on their cluster right now, but my understanding is they're going to in the future. So I'm kind of interested in how if we have anything in mind with regards to progressing for a management solution for internal, you know, for development, for demos, et cetera, in order to minimize uptime, therefore minimizing the being nickeled and dimed.
Davis, did you want to add in to your comment there?
Yeah, sure. I'll let someone else answer this because I think it's mainly an architectural question, but I was just commenting on the cost today. GK is not a significant portion of our total cost today, but this will increase in the future as the management fees get introduced. And I know in some projects we do have a lot of different clusters, so those will start getting charged to us pretty soon. So it is something we should address, but I just wanted to put that context there.
Yeah, so I think I'll add, thank you for that, Davis, and thanks for the question, James. So add that we have had a lot of focus recently on cost efficiency, pure cost reduction in some areas. In other areas, you know, how can we be more efficient? And we've taken that kind of in a priority approach, as far as like, you know, finding the biggest expenses that we can make the largest difference to. And those have been pretty successful so far. But one area that I certainly know that we can do more is kind of the automation around some of the demo environments, the environments that, you know, as a solutions consultant, you use, but to your point, like, you don't use 24/7. all those environments that are, there's a ton of those in AWS that I'm aware of, and there's also some, in GCP. And so we're working along with, actually I should say we will be working more along with Brian and with IT to figure out, how do we manage that kind of in a long-term way and get the most efficiency out of it, because those costs are not going to go down, in the future. As we just continue to grow, we're going to have more and more of those that are either, affiliated with each individual that's doing demos, or if we can do things better and have some shared environments, or at least, to your point, environments that are only active when they're actually being used or needed.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. That's, that's kind of the way I'm looking at it. It's even if it's not a big hit right now, as the company grows, it's going to increase unless something changes, right? And thank you. That makes sense.
Yeah. And even, I do want to make the point, like, even areas that aren't a huge item right now, I certainly don't want any of the message to be that those aren't important, because all of those things add up, and they're all part of the solution. It's just a matter of like how many of them, we can kind of actively hit at the same time. And if you have some more input or want to team up on, how to create more of a solution for this, given that you certainly understand the other side of it, which is the work that you need to do, and when and what kind of resources you need, we'd certainly welcome that.
Yeah, thank you.
Jarv, if you want to provide some more information here.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I added a couple comments. Just one is the handbook page for how these accounts are managed. I think we're talking about the GitLab internal and GitLab demos accounts, as well as the DigitalOcean dev resources accounts. These are the three places where the engineering organizations and marketing, they spin up, one-off instances or Kubernetes clusters that tend to live for a long time. We have two issues that are now kind of like going through those accounts and clearing out things that we don't need or unclaimed or that have been sitting for a while. And then I know that there are discussions about what the next steps are going to be, whether it's going to be some sort of janitor that kind of manages these two catch-all accounts, or whether we probably will go to individual accounts that are tied to each department. So each user will have their own account. But I think these are we're in very early discussions about this, but it's definitely also something that we're thinking about now with the spend reduction efforts.
Makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and maybe just lastly on that, I guess kind of coupled with George's item there, where we're kind of discussing, tying them to different departments and everything. We're also working with some of the reporting. We have a couple new tools that we're using, but also just, trying to figure out overall reporting, how we create visibility into the use. Not so much that, like, we're not interested in like going and doing a bunch of like complicated chargebacks or anything like that, but it's just important that we create the visibility around, where is it being spent, the transparency all around that, because the more that we do that, the more everyone can kind of be part of the solution.
Absolutely. That's a good way to go, because it's easy to think, okay, this is only a nickel, or this is only a couple of pennies, or this is only $1, but then you think about, I've got 5 of them running and they're running 24/7, and it adds up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for the concern about that and for the question, James. Right, we're at the bottom of the question. Still have
I want to call out that your presentation is a lot of fun. Like, it contains so many links. It's a lot of fun to kind of go through everything, and thanks for providing so much detail. And it gives a good sense of the amazing progress that's being made.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That is definitely a team effort, and with the new kind of SRE teams, each taking more specific ownership of various areas, as well as the scalability and delivery team, all kind of like having a much kind of clearer idea of their mission forward and everything. It's a lot easier when they all jump into the slides and can clearly identify like, hey, these are the things that we're focused on, and together that really adds up to a lot of good movements forward.
I'll jump in here. I'll write my question in the doc shortly, but with a couple of minutes left, I wanted to try and encourage a bit of synchronous discussion around rack attack and other sort of denial of service protections we've got. We've got a large unnamed .con customer that is working to adopt our Vault integration, but as we've seen recently, they can be a bit troubled by bad creds, and what that means is, one group might create a lot of like 403 failed authentication attempts to a certain endpoint, and they might be behind a NAT gateway where a lot of other teams are. And our current like block strategy might mean that, one team or one individual that makes a small mistake could negatively impact for the period of an hour plus multiple teams. And I was just curious if folks had some thoughts or ideas. There's an issue I'll link in doc here around strategies we could adopt to sort of limit the potential for like inadvertent negative impact that still protect us from bad actors.
And maybe to if I could ask a little clarifying thing, if I'm getting concerned right, is it kind of around the bad neighbor impact, given that we are a multi-tenant SaaS solution, and so the bad effect that the impact of abuse towards one customer account can have on other customer accounts, depending on how we architect limits and protections.
Not even so much abuse; it's more a question of like if I like inherit a pipeline template, but then fail to properly configure my Vault integration, I might inadvertently generate, I think it's if you create more than 10 failed authentication attempts, we ban you at the HA proxy level for an hour. And if there's other teams sharing a cluster or behind the same NAT gateway, maybe they're working out of the same office, they all start to see failed, Vault credential retrieval attempts. And that's, kind of a blast radius that feels pretty large. So today that's as a result of the fact that we ban on a per IP basis, which is sort of the pretty, to my knowledge, a pretty established precedent, and one that I think is pretty necessary to prevent abuse and bad actors. I was just curious if there's other ideas around what we could do to limit the inadvertent negative impact that a customer might impose upon themselves while still protecting ourselves.
I think also that we intended those rack attack rules for our authentication, people signing into GitLab, not automated authentication to Vault. So I think that we probably don't want to have the same rules for two very different use cases, namely humans versus bots or APIs.
Just one other point is that at the moment, we have rack attack, we have HA proxy rules, and now we've also got Cloudflare and web application firewall. And so there's a lot of layers that are kind of intermingling where things can be applied. And I don't know if other people have more insight into this, but it feels to me like we need to do a bit of normalization of that. And then sort of tied into that, one of the other problems, I think, is that we have very, very high rates of for allowing anonymous users to do things on gitlab.com, where I think we should rather kind of bring those rates right down. And if you don't have if you're not authenticated, your rate limiting is way lower. But then if you are authenticated, you get a much higher rate limit. And that would solve a lot of these kind of problems, because at the moment we're blocking people on IP, but we're not sort of forcing them to authenticate. If you look at the GitHub API, just as a comparison, the rate limits are kind of laughably low for anonymous access. It's like 60 requests an hour or something. No, it's not that low, but it's really, really low. And then anything else you need to be authenticated. And so because of that, they're not sort of just relying on IP, they're relying on access tokens, which is a better approach, I think. But there's like a whole bunch of work that needs to be done around that, and kind of round that off after the the work that's been done.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that, say that's kind of a kind of product question in what the limits are. We have a lot of API endpoints right now that don't require authentication at all to run, and that's part of it. So there's some thinking about whether those should really be completely unauthenticated and public to begin with on .com.
Did you have a last comment there, Sid, before we wrap up?
No, I think Andrew nailed it with the authenticated versus non-authenticated and a lot of duplication. And I would love for a lot of the prevention to end up in the product, because we have projects like Debian running very big public servers. So if we put everything in Cloudflare, it's going to be hard to translate that. So let's make sure we put it in our web application firewall in the product, ship it as part of the product as much as we can.
Great. Thank you, Jamie, for that question. And thanks everyone else for your questions and for joining us today for the infrastructure group conversation. Hope you all have a great day. Thanks.